COVID-19 has given us all sorts of new words, language that prior to March we never believed would become part of our daily, natural, regular vocabulary. Face masks, quarantine, hotspots, and as we discussed last week, this phrase, "we are in this together." It's also given us a host of acronyms, including PPP, Paycheck Protection Program. This program provided small businesses with loans to pay up to 8 weeks of payroll costs if they would keep those employees employed. It helped keep them afloat during the dark, dismal days of late March and most of April. And then, if they did this, these loans would be completely forgiven. Now, as with anything to do with the government, the forgiveness part of the program is laden with rules and procedures and paperwork. I can attest, because my husband's department was part of this, it is ridiculous. It was enough to make your head spin. It's hard work to forgive. This may be how the disciples felt when Peter, always Peter asking the tough questions, when Peter asked about the number of times he needed to forgive. In other words, what are the rules surrounding how much I need to forgive? How about 7 times? That's surely enough, don't you think, Jesus? Jesus' unpredictable answer no doubt left the disciples confused and trying to do a little quick math. This passage follows on last week's readings, which concluded by Jesus assuring us that wherever 2 or 3 were gathered together, Jesus would be there in our midst. But Peter doesn't allow us to linger in that moment, because Peter knew, and we can all attest, there was no question the church would be a place of sinners. Not only would sinners need forgiveness from God, they would need it from one another. But how many times, Peter's wondering, do I have to forgive someone? How many times do you take them back? Now, Peter understood the rabbinic tradition of the day, as surely Jesus did, which said to forgive a man 3 times. You're not obligated to forgive him 4. So when Peter expands that teaching, moving it from 3 acts of forgiveness to 7, Peter thinks he's being really generous. Peter not only doubles that expected number, he adds 1 to it, perhaps knowing that 7 is considered the perfect number and is traditionally the number associated with God. He knows that Jesus is merciful, and so he expects Jesus to be quite pleased with his liberal interpretation of the law, and then throwing in an extra. Good old Peter, always trying to go the extra mile to get a few brownie points with Jesus. But of course, Peter, like this cartoon depicts, is still thinking about the count. In case you can't read that, the guy is holding up the ledger and says, as you can clearly see by this ledger, you have been forgiven 490 times and are no longer covered by your biblical policy. He needs to pay off his debt. Peter is like this ledger, still thinking about keeping count, still thinking about keeping the books, and if you do everything right, you'll get forgiveness, but only up to a point. And Jesus turns Peter's question on its head by replying with this ridiculous, even impossible reply. You want to play the numbers game, Jesus seems to be saying? Okay, how about this one? And he throws out a number that really isn't even quantifiable, because the translation could either mean 77 or it could mean 490. Poor Peter just wants to know what he's supposed to do, just like so many of us. And then Jesus points out that's not the question you should be asking. And then, because this is Matthew, he tells a parable. An absurd parable, shocking in its hyperbole. This absurdity is evident from the get-go. When the king begins settling accounts, there is one slave who owes him 10,000 talents. Now, a single talent was the equivalent of many, many years of labor. So 10,000 of these would be an impossible amount to repay. No way he could repay that much, and knowing kings as we do, a king would surely not even entertain forgiving such an enormous amount. This is, in today's vernacular, a LOL, a laugh out loud moment. But we are told the king did forgive the servant. But then another servant, someone sort of lower down on the hierarchical chain, owes this now forgiven one 100 denarii, and he demands to be paid what he owes. Now, a single denarii was worth about a day's wage. So the amount this forgiven servant is asking for is just over 3 months. Not insignificant, but compared to what had just been forgiven, it was really next to nothing. It was meaningless. But the forgiven servant refuses to forgive this second debt. And now the king reneges on his offer of forgiveness for the one who owed so much. And because that one doesn't show mercy as he did, he's sent away to prison to be punished. I don't think it's really that Jesus wants Peter to increase his forgiveness quota. It's that he wants Peter to stop counting altogether. Because forgiveness, like love, is inherently and intimately relational, not legal, not contractual. Can't be counted. Had Peter asked Jesus how many times he should be loving his neighbor, we'd maybe understand Peter's misunderstanding. Love can't be quantified. But he asks about forgiveness, and we miss his mistake because we too like to count. We like to have some ground rules. But Jesus is offering Peter and us another reality. Stop asking questions like, how much should I forgive? Because the one who is counting the number of times he or she says, yeah, sure, you're forgiven, probably really isn't forgiving at all. And the parable isn't saying that we should keep forgiving and forgiving without truly forgiving, because how can our heart be in it if we just keep pressing the forgiveness button? It's not a Staples Easy button. The entire exchange with Peter and this subsequent parable instead invite us into a new way of being, but that doesn't make forgiving any easier, now does it? I find it interesting that this lesson comes on the anniversary week of 9/11. Surely the worst atrocity in our recent living memories, a date hard to forget, even in the midst of COVID. A date even harder to forgive because that date involves and evokes disgust and anger and hardened hearts. Nadia Bolz-Weber, a Lutheran minister, wrote some years ago when reflecting on this passage and its timing so close to 9/11, "From where will we attain this forgiveness for those who have caused us such harm? I'll tell you one thing for sure. It ain't in my heart. No, sir. It's kind of dark in here." If any forgiveness is in our hearts at all, it's surely an uneasy forgiveness of those who did us such harm. And we, in our United States of America, now face additional challenges in our need of forgiveness in our divided nation, divided economically, divided politically, divided racially. We need to confront what forgiveness, according to Jesus, is and what it is not. Jesus talked about forgiveness over and over and over again because he knew that living life in community is really hard. And forgiveness is an act and an art which must be practiced over and over again. Now, the word forgive comes from this Greek word called aphemi, which is, like forgiveness, multi-layered in its meaning. It can mean to give up a debt, to keep it no longer. It means simply to open your hand and drop whatever it is that you are clutching. Forgiveness means to let go, to release it. It's not denying our hurt or our pain, because by minimizing or glossing over that, we cannot really forgive. Forgiveness is a possibility only when we acknowledge that hurt and the negative impact that it has caused us. This goes against the grain of a society where one of the primary ways that we gain power is by accruing debts that we think are owed to us, the ledger. Refusing to forgive someone who has harmed us can hold deep appeal because it may seem like that's the only way that we can have any power at all. Any control. Yet, as this parable so vividly shows us, our lack of forgiveness can eventually become a prison that not only holds the other person, but also holds holds our very selves. Author Frederick Buechner warns us about the dangers of reliving our past hurts, holding on to deep wounds when he says, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is probably the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll your tongue over the prospect of bitter confrontations still to come, to savor to the last toothsome morsel of both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it's a feast for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. One of the most challenging parts of offering forgiveness is the sense that the offender doesn't really deserve, hasn't earned our forgiveness. But forgiveness is not just about what you are offering someone else. It's about what you are offering yourself. Forgiveness is a decision about how you and I want to live. It's taking control of how much power you allow someone else's sin to have over you. It's a mistake to think or confuse forgiveness with justice, to think that you withholding our forgiveness is a form of punishment for the person who hurt you. In fact, the opposite is true. As the saying often goes, holding on to anger or withholding forgiveness is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. It never works that way. Forgiveness is a way for us to unburden ourselves from the constant pressure of rewriting the past. Henry Nouwen writes this: forgiveness is the name of love practiced among people who love poorly. The hard truth is that all people love poorly, and so we need to forgive and be forgiven every day. Forgiveness is the great work of love among the fellowship of the weak that is the human family. If this is correct, then perhaps the first step in forgiveness is to choose to live in love instead of resentment. Don't drink the poison. To choose to forgive is to release ourselves from the oppression of our own bitterness. To offer forgiveness in this sense means that we refuse to allow another's sins to control us, to hold us, to bind us. It means our longing for absolution and justice is known to God. It means to dive deep into Christ's heart for healing, because he's the only one powerful enough to secure that healing. Jesus' words remind us how important it is for us to persist in the art of forgiveness, to work to keep our hearts clear, to not allow the destructiveness of another to inhabit and overtake our soul. Forgiveness is hard, and it isn't something that we can always just conjure up on our own. It It instead requires a combination of work and grace, opening ourselves to this as a possibility, to ask God for us to want to forgive, sometimes long before we can actually do it. The forgiveness itself, that ability to release, to let go, to loose the bindings, to break the chains that bind us, that is the graceful work of God, who does the same for each and every one of us. It's not about math or ledgers or how many times we forgive, but rather remembering that we have been given forgiveness, and so we strive to forgive as well. As C.S. Lewis says, to be a Christian means to forgive the unexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. May we let a little light in. May we loose the chains that bind us. And then may we strive to pay forward the grace and the forgiveness that has been offered to us through Jesus Christ until justice reigns and God's kingdom is known here on earth as in heaven.